So today I'm going over this article titled Elliot Temple Violated Our Privacy that I published in February. It's a longer article, 17-minute read, so I want to give you a summary here of what happened. This is part of a larger expose that I've written about Temple. Temple is a very toxic person, and there's a lot to talk about when it comes to Temple. And in this particular instance, I want to talk about a specifically nasty violation of our privacy that Temple committed back in 2020. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening here, especially when it comes to, although I don't think that was Temple himself, there is a computer hack that I'm about to get into, something called social engineering. So you're going to want to stick around to learn how that works and how somebody weaseled their way into a private Discord server. So this guy, Elliot Temple, he also goes by the name Curi. That's kind of his online identity. He runs a discussion forum. It used to be known as a Fallible Ideas Forum. That's what it was called when I was active in it. Now it's called the Critical Fallibilism Group. And I started talking to Temple in late 2018 because I was interested in some topics that they were discussing in their group. And I was active until early 2019, mostly in a private group of theirs. And I ran screaming because it was awful. And many other people who had joined FI, Fallible Ideas, also ended up quitting. When I say I ran screaming, it's because the group was very toxic. That's putting it mildly. I wrote a whole article about how toxic Temple's group is and how toxic he is as a person. The privacy violation is a major part of that, but there's way more. It's wild, some of the stuff that he does, like really creepy and abusive behavior. There's the authoritarianism in his group, the adversarial group environment, the public shaming. I'll get into that in a moment. The verbal abuse. I hesitate to even say this here on YouTube because if I read this out loud, I think YouTube might punish my or demote my content. But he repeatedly tells someone here, tells him this, tells his former mentor David Deutsch this, you suck. I can probably say that. And then he told him this, which is like, that's such an abusive thing to say to somebody. And he told him that repeatedly over years, right? And these are just instances of what kind of went on in that group. It's just a terrible place to be. I certainly wish I had never contacted Temple because this has been haunting me for years. But anyway, because a bunch of people left FI, Temple thought it would be wise to publish a list of all the people he had left and deride them as evaders. So he published this creepy list of Fallible Ideas evaders. It was put together by his longtime associate, Alan Forrester, about people who, quote, quit, evaded, lied, etc. Okay, and they pretended that the purpose of the list was to find patterns about what goes wrong. I think until today they haven't found that pattern, but if a lot of people stop talking to you, maybe at some point you should look in the mirror. I think Elliot knows damn well what's going on there. Anyway, some of those quote-unquote evaders, they still wanted to find a place where they could discuss their interests. So there were two former members of FI, Bruce Nielsen and Aaron Stuppel. They created a new group called the Four Strands. I'm going to refer to them as 4S. And that's a reference to a concept by physicist David Deutsch. And Nielsen and Stuppel were fans of Deutsch, or still are, I think, and so was I, and still am. And the 4S group had an email group, a Slack server, and a Discord server. Okay, but the group was private. The public couldn't read any of our messages, and you had to be invited. Okay, now, the FI group there's a public record of Elliot Temple and other FI members talking about us in their public Discord server. So here are some of the public records. Somebody named The Rat, commonly in those forums, people go by pseudonyms. Obviously, it's not a real name, but somebody called himself The Rat. They said that we, meaning the 4 Strands people, 4S people, were not, at the time, this is 2019, were not interested in discussing with fallible ideas people. Elliot, again, is curi. A little later, he replies, why? None of them explain. This is a thing he does pretty compulsively, I think. He keeps putting off responsibility or accountability on others. He expects others to explain themselves to him. We're going to see a lot more of that, not only in this article, but also in that article about his toxicity. There's a lot of that going on. Freeze, another associate of Temple's, and by the way, the rat and Freeze were also part of the Four Strands, but they were trusted at the time. We trusted them. Freeze wrote to Temple and others in the FI group that we, the Four Strands, had a Slack and a Google group. And then the rat said about us, I've had productive discussions with some of them, but they asked for privacy. And once again, curi, kind of knee-jerk reaction about, deflecting responsibility. Surely they could publicly write their reasons for privacy. Okay, so this chat log establishes that Temple not only knew of our existence, knew of the existence of the Four Strands, but he also knew that we didn't want to talk to him because the rat had made it clear that we weren't interested in discussing with FI people, and Temple is an FI person. But that didn't stop him from trying to get access to our group. And we'll see soon that he actually made several attempts, some pretty nasty. And, well, let's get right into it. First, he just asked directly. So he asked Bruce Nielsen on January 18th, 2020. He emailed him, I think. I think that was that was in a comment on that idea of that evaders list. May I join the Four Strands group? Or the Four Strands groups, plural. It's a Slack and a Google group, end quote. And then Temple says he also DM'd Nielsen on Twitter the next day, and he claims that Nielsen did not reply. I say he claims because Temple is a notoriously unreliable narrator. We're going to see some of that in this article too. So I would take everything that Temple says, I quote with the utmost care, but I would take everything Temple says with a huge grain of salt. Anyway, Temple also emailed me, also on January 19th, asking if he can join the Four Strands groups. This is already a little suspicious, like texting or emailing people 3 times. I don't think it was text, but like messaging people 3 times in a span of 2 days. He seems to have some sense of urgency that we just didn't share. It's kind of suspicious why it was suddenly so urgent to join our group. Anyway, up to this point, it sounded pretty innocent enough. Like he was probably hoping that we hadn't read the chat log above and that we didn't know that he knew that we wanted privacy. Anyway, I knew that I wanted nothing to do with that guy, and I presumed that the others probably wouldn't either. They had left his forum for a reason, like I can put 2 and 2 together. And I also knew from experience, because he does these long, drawn-out discussions that go absolutely nowhere, that twist and turn and just absolutely overwhelm you, which maybe is the purpose, I don't know. But if I knew that if I engage in any way, even if I said no, that it would just draw me in further and encourage more unwanted communication. So I just didn't respond. So, it's kind of like if you go on a date with somebody and after they don't text you back and they never call you back, no answer is an answer. They're telling you they don't want to talk to you. Okay, but apparently he didn't get it. Well, actually, I think he did get it. I'll say more about that later because he's socially competent, so he can't blame incompetence, but we'll get into that. Now, here's the shocking thing that happened. A couple days later, this is now 2020, January 21st, 2020, somebody hacked into the Four Strands. How did they do this? I want to be clear from the outset that I don't think this was Temple, but I still think it's worth investigating because the timing is very suspicious, and there's something up there. There's still things that are unclear about it that I think we should seek clarity on. And it's also suspicious because I've asked Elliot about this, and he's evaded the question. So how did this hacker get access to our groups? So the hack is known as a social engineering attack. There's this guy, Kevin Mitnick. I think he recently died, unfortunately. He wrote some great books about hacking and how to keep your organization secure. And in a previous life, he was a hacker, and a pretty notorious one. And for a while, he was the most wanted hacker in the world, I think, or at least in the States. And he explained in an interview with CNN, quote, "Social engineering is using manipulation, influence, and deception to get a person, a trusted insider within an organization, to comply with a request, and the request is usually to release information or to perform some sort of action item that benefits the attacker," end quote. So what happened here? This Twitter account showed up all of a sudden, Reason and Science fan. Okay. Again, this is January 2020. They had only joined that same month. I think maybe that same day. I forget if you can see that on Twitter. But even if it was earlier in January, that's still suspicious. If an account is brand new like that, they haven't established themselves as trustworthy. They don't have many followers. They haven't built any rapport with anyone or the community. But anyway, their very first tweet was from January 21st, so I think it was probably from that day. The account was created on that day. Now, the reason they chose the words Reason and Science fan is because the Four Strands was a philosophy discussion forum that was all about science and reason. So they wanted to appeal to us, to the members of the Four Strands. And the same goes for this profile picture and banner picture. They just picked this stock photo. Why is this gone all of a sudden? Okay, I'm not going to do this right now, but it's just the stock photo on istockphoto.com. So they just picked you out. I think this is one of those things that it's like this globe thing. I think it's the inside of that electric globe that if you put your fingers on it, the electricity touches your fingers on the inside. I think it's a photo of that, but anyway, it's supposed to be some cool scientific phenomenon that people who are interested in science it's supposed to speak to them, I guess. Anyway, since the account was brand new, RSF, that's how I refer to them for short, Reason and Science fan, RSF. Since the account was brand new, they had to create social proof. So they started retweeting accounts that Four Strands people were interested in. They followed accounts that Four Strands people were interested in. Some of those people then followed back, which created further social proof. They tweeted with them, all these kinds of things. It created activity, it created some sort of momentum, you could say. And also RSF requested help. They wanted to know where they can talk about CR. CR stands for critical rationalism. That's a philosophy by Karl Popper that we were all interested in at the Four Strands. So he wanted to know where he could discuss that. Now, of course, he already knew of the existence of the Four Strands, but he pretended not to know where he could talk about it. I say he, who knows, maybe it was a girl. I should say they, it doesn't matter. If I say he, I'm not saying this was necessarily a guy. But RSF got one person, Brett Hall, who's one of the bigger names in the CR space, to reply. This created quite a bit of social proof. And RSF then had more questions, and so then Bruce Nielsen, who was again one of our admins, responded saying, if you give me your email address, I'll get you into the group. What's interesting is that Nielsen said, I'll get you into the group singular, and then Reason and Science fan says, I would like to join all the groups plural. Recall earlier in this public record of Temple's chat logs that he was told that we have a Slack and a Google group, so more than one. So, again, that record is public, so maybe RSF read it at the time, but clearly they knew, they kind of confessed that here. They already knew that there were multiple groups. Anyway, it's possible, though, I'd have to review all the tweets. I should say, in fairness to RSF, it's possible that somebody mentioned this also on Twitter, that there were multiple Four Strands groups. I would have to double check. In any case, seeing all this, I mean, I've been a software engineer for over 10 years, for over a decade. I've worked in cybersecurity. I used to work at Apple for years. Like, I saw this, I'm qualified to speak on this. I saw this happening, or I don't think I saw it live. I think I saw it later. But I immediately recognized what was going on here. This is a social engineering attack. It's clear. It's all the makings of a social engineering attack. Anonymous person joined that month, possibly that day, pretending not to know where they could target. They clearly just wanted to get into the group. It was plain as day to me. Now, there's a misconception that hackers sit in the basement all day and that they don't know how to talk to people. That's not true. Hackers are very interested in human beings in particular and how to manipulate them and how to wrap them around your finger, because human beings are usually, almost always, the weakest link in any secure system. If you put yourself in the shoes of a hacker, if you get access, if you intercept an encrypted message, say, trying to brute force, which means like trying all the possible combinations of a password to decrypt that message, is going to be next to impossible. Like, it would just take way too long. But if you can manipulate a human being who has the key into giving you the key, that's way easier. So that's why these hackers hone their social skills. But again, Kevin Mitnick is a good source on this topic. Ghost in the Wires is a book that he wrote on this topic. Basically, social engineers prey on people's kindness and general willingness to help. It's really awful. It's very manipulative. And Bruce Nielsen was the perfect victim in this case, because Nielsen is a helpful, kind person who wanted to help. He wanted to help RSF get into the group so that they could discuss, critical rationalism and David Deutsch's philosophy. And here's where it gets really interesting. Nielsen, this is the Discord activity log. Nielsen shared this with me at the time. This is the activity log, and it goes from bottom to top because it's sorted in reverse. So if we read it from bottom to top, it's going to be in chronological order. So he created the invite, and so again, remember that our group was private, and so the public couldn't read anything. So you had to be invited. The way this works is the owner of the server, the Discord group, creates the invite, and then this invite usually has always has some signifier, and that shares that with the person that they want to invite. Okay. Now Bruce creates this invite, N6N and so on. Okay, at 7:25 p.m. Hopefully we have these timestamps. All right. Last Tuesday refers to that same day that this Twitter account by RSF showed up. So this is still the same day. It's later that night. Okay. Nielsen creates this invite at 7:25 p.m. and shared it with RSF. I spoke to Nielsen about this at the time. And Elliot Temple, joined immediately thereafter, like moments thereafter. Now the log doesn't show join events, but it does show other activity. It shows that Elliot, again, curi is Elliot Temple, that he created an invite. In fact, he created 2 invites only minutes after Bruce had invited RSF. Okay. So since this is the first activity, he must have joined before then. So who knows, maybe 5 minutes after, 6, 7 minutes after, something like that. Okay. So Temple had requested our permission to join, but he hadn't gotten it. And he had explicitly been told about our desire for privacy. So he should have known not to join, right? He felt the need to ask for permission a couple of days prior. So he still should have felt the need now. If he had had any regard for our consent, if he had had any respect for our privacy, he would not have done that. But not only did he join our server against our will, he actually created more invites. Right? So he did the same thing Nielsen did. I think Nielsen was unaware at the time that members could create new invites. So Temple created 2 invites, 2 SB and so on, and TME, blah, blah, blah. Now, the first one, I did a literal string search on Google. I searched the fallible ideas, Discord archives too, like all the chat logs programmatically, right? You can't find this invite anywhere. Now, Kevin Mitnick explains in his book Ghosts in the Wires, he explains that people who gain unauthorized access to a system, what they commonly do is they'll install a backdoor of some sort, so that if they get kicked out, if an admin notices them, it kicks them out, but the admin doesn't notice the backdoor, then the same intruder can use it later to get back in. So that's one possibility. Okay. And by the way, Temple himself is a software engineer, right? So he must have anticipated getting kicked out and counted on us not noticing his backdoor. Didn't work, but he tried. Now this other invite, TME and so on, he shared with his associates in his Discord server. And by the way, his Discord server, again, was public, right? So anybody could read that, I think, effectively live, maybe with like a 5-minute delay. So he had so little regard for our privacy that he just shared it with the world, basically. He gave the entire world access to our private server, a server that he knew was private, that he knew wanted nothing to do with him. Or at least didn't want to talk to him, let's put it that way. And promptly, a few, or at least a couple of members of his forum raided our server. So here's the proof that he shared it. That's a quote from his blog. That's the invite that he shared. So yeah, he did that. And then he actually talks about this, just telling on himself. He talks about this with his mob of associates again. And so he shares the invite 9:34 p.m. I think this is Eastern time, so this is like 9:34 p.m. That's 7:34 p.m. Mountain time, because Bruce created the screenshot in Mountain time. So like literally the same minute that he created this invite, he shared it with his followers. If there was zero hesitation, so clearly that was his intention all along. Somebody who has since been deleted asked him what it was, what that invite was for. Temple then claims that it was people, the 4 strands, quote, who slander FI and try to undermine it. What is splinter community, end quote. Freeze asks, did you leave or were you kicked? This is 9:51. By this time, so like 8 or 9 minutes earlier, Nielsen had banned Elliot. Freeze had seen this and asked him, did you leave or were you kicked? So again, Temple tells on himself, says he was kicked. And then he says, I asked Bruce and Dennis if I could join the forum the other day and didn't get a response yet. It sounds wonderfully innocuous and innocent. Someone sent me the Discord invite link just now. Temple writes he was kicked from our Discord, meaning he accessed it in the first place by his own admission. So this is also how you can tell that this screenshot is authentic. And then there's actually a lot of, like, this looks pretty innocuous again, but there's actually a lot of interesting stuff happening here where if you do some close reading, you see a lot of things that don't add up. For instance, he says that he innocently asked for access and just hasn't gotten a response yet. So it's as if he was still waiting for us to give him access, right? But in reality, he must have concluded that we weren't going to give him access and decided that this was the way to get access against our will. This is also, again, an implicit a shift of accountability from him to Nielsen and me, because he was effectively claiming that, implicitly at least, that it would have been on us to deny him access, explicitly, right? And then he would have involved us in another discussion about how we should explain our reasoning to his satisfaction, stuff like that, so that he would have known not to join. So it's really our fault that he joined, basically, is what he's implying here. But then the question is, why did he find it necessary to ask for permission in the first place? And the reason there is not because he had any respect for our privacy, but because there was a technological restriction that he had to get around. And it would make no sense to try to so eagerly join a community that slanders and undermines his. Like, why would you want to join that community? If there's animosity, then he already knows that we wouldn't voluntarily give him access anyway. So none of this makes sense. It's like full of inconsistencies and lies. Okay. Again, this word someone is suspicious, noteworthy. someone sent me the Discord invite link just now. It's like, okay, I mean, Nielsen told me at the time that RSF denied having shared their invite. And that's weird because they were brand new to the group, right? So they could have claimed not to know that they weren't supposed to invite others, right? They would have had plausible deniability there. So here Temple shifts accountability yet again, like something he keeps doing over and over. He implies that his joining is really not his own responsibility, but the responsibility of that someone. So why not just name that person? And the part just now further confirms how quickly Temple joined our server by his own admission, right? So again, he's telling on himself. It's all in public, which just shows how shameless he is. And then the question also is, why does he share a new invite with his associates, but by passing it off as the one that he had used to join? Because remember, the invite that Nielsen shared with RSF is this one, N6N. The invite that Temple shared with his associates was this one, right? TME and so on. And he says, someone sent me the Discord invite link just now. That lets people believe that that he gave them the same invite link that he was given, which is not the case. Like, he doesn't explicitly tell them it's the same invite, but he lets them believe that it was. Anyway, so from that point on, there was just constant dread because Temple had proved that he was pretty ruthless and was willing to try basically anything to get into our private space. But he still laughed about it. He thought it was funny. And so then he said that he was going to publish a blog post about us, or he derided us as a quote-unquote shadow community, which basically just means we were private and he couldn't see our messages. And this thing about how we were allegedly trying to split a small CR community into factions, this is weird. I think that there's some psychological confession in there as to, it's a little bit like if you operate a sandwich store on a street corner, okay, and then you kind of think that that presence there that you've established, that entitles you to that block or that intersection or whatever. And now there's a new store selling sandwiches that open up across the street. And so now you're saying, hey man, you're splitting the sandwich community into factions. Well, no, you don't have a claim to that city block just because you've been there first or something, Other people have a right to sell their sandwiches too. Your competitor, whom we never tried to compete with Temple, or at least I never saw us as competing with him or trying to. We were just interested in discussing things that he also discussed in his forum, and we just didn't want to talk to him because he's toxic. If he ever looked in the mirror and took any responsibility for his actions, a lot of these problems might be solved, but he never seems to do that. So we're just kind of stuck. I write more about the entrenchment patterns of this sort in my article on his toxicity. There's a whole section on it. But basically, he doesn't seem to understand that the reason the four strands existed in the first place, he's kind of the reason that the four strands existed in the first place, because if his group had been any good, we never would have seen any reason to make that group. So he had his chance and he blew it, basically. But it was clear that our mere existence bothered him. Again, going back to the sandwich store, you can't complain that there's a competitor, perceived or real, across the street. You can't claim that they're splitting the sandwich community into factions. It'd be ridiculous to claim that. And it's just as ridiculous for him to claim that we were splitting the community into factions. That's just not true. It's a gross misrepresentation of what happened there. So anyway, last year I actually reached out to him against my better judgment. And I asked him how he infiltrated our group. And he just didn't answer that question. He completely evaded it, which is ironic given the title of his list of evaders. But again, I do want to be clear that I don't think Temple was RSF because it just wouldn't make sense. By the way, I should say it would have been so easy consider this. Given how quickly Temple joined after Nielsen gave RSF the invite, it would have been so easy to make it look like Temple was the social engineer who hacked into our space. But I didn't do that. And that sets me apart from Temple, because Temple defamed me, and I go into this in another article, where he knew he was making an arbitrary claim and lied, and must have known that he was lying by giant omission. I'll get into that later in a different video. He was clearly not conscientious in his communication, but I am. I'm a more reliable communicator than he is. Anyway, if he responds to this, he's probably going to refer to something about misquotes, which I've already addressed, so just so you know. I'll get into that in another video, probably. Anyway, where was I? Right, I asked, okay, right, so I don't think that Temple was RSF, because if Temple had wanted to join 4S in secret, then he would have remained hidden behind RSF's fake identity. Because that way he could have kept reading our messages over the coming months. I just don't know who RSF was. Okay, they made a Gmail address. Right, we saw that in the screenshot up here. That's their Gmail. And I think Gmail requires a phone number when you sign up. So maybe if one day I get a subpoena for Google's records, maybe we'll find out who RSF really was. My lawyers, whom I've had to hire because Temple has been defaming me for years, like I've said, they have placed him on a spoliation hold. That means he has to hold on to evidence. So maybe we'll get more information that way at some point if I ever sue him. But what we do know, because it's public, is that RSF disappeared that same day, like right after the hack on January 21st. That was their last tweet when they said they want to join all the groups, and then they just disappeared, just vanished into thin air. And so clearly then the account's sole purpose was to gain access to the 4 strands, right? I did some investigating myself online, and I also hired 2 private investigators, but they couldn't really find any promising leads. But I have reported the hack to the authorities because my lawyers recommended that I do that. Now, one theory is maybe RSF was a troll who was aware of the conflict, who was aware that Elliot didn't like us, didn't like the fact that we existed, and wanted to escalate the conflict and make it look like Temple was RSF. And then watch as both sides fought, right? That kind of psychological, I think that's a form of psychological triangulation. Don't quote me on it, I'd have to double check. But that's something trolls do. They stoke the flames of a conflict and then sit back and watch people fight. It's an awful thing to do, but there are such people. So maybe, if that is the case, maybe RSF set up a honeypot that Temple just couldn't resist, right? And then also fed Temple more messages later on, as we'll see. The thing is, and also Temple did get access, or actually I can get into that now, some more download messages later on, because Temple not only got access to our Discord group, he must have gotten access to, or well, he may have gotten, I should clarify, he may have gotten email access because, well, at least he got some email access because two days after the hack, Temple emailed me with a quote from our email group, from the 4 Strands email group, and later he published it without my consent. So he must have gotten some access to our email group as well, whether directly or through somebody who was feeding him messages, I don't know. In any case, let's just assume this theory is true, right? This RSF guy, or girl, who knows, set up a honeypot. Temple couldn't resist, fell into it. Then why didn't Temple just tell me that? He could have just said, hey, you know what? I got carried away. There was this person, they tricked me, right? He loves blaming other people, as we've seen. So why didn't he just say, hey, this guy tricked me? Okay. So I don't think that theory is right. And then also the question is, why did RSF, if that had been the case, why did RSF join the Discord themselves? Because if they had wanted to look like Temple, they wouldn't have joined at all. Remember that Bruce Nielsen banned Science and Reason Fan, so that means Science and Reason Fan joined at some point. Okay. But in any case, even if that had been the case, even if Temple had fallen into a honeypot that he simply could not resist, Temple still should have known to ask whether it was okay for him to join. And he knew the answer would have been no, or might as well have been, right? But he didn't care. That's how he determined, roughly, regard for consent. So if the answer maybe no, or might as well be, but you do it anyway, then you have disregard for that person's consent. So Temple really doesn't have any plausible deniability here, especially after making more invites for himself and others. So I think his request from the start that, may I join the Four Strands groups, like that sounds innocent enough, but I think that was bad faith from the start. Yeah. Skipping some, the next attempt, Temple mounted pressure. Okay. He emailed just a day after that hack. Temple emailed Nielsen and me again, right? He's again like the guy who doesn't get a call back after a date and keeps calling, wondering why she won't return his calls. Temple claimed that one of our group members, one of the Four Strands members, Andy B, was a quote-unquote aggressor who had been harassing him and made several anonymous accounts, but apparently not RSF's account. We just were so annoyed with Temple at this point. Like, why would Temple assume that we would entertain anything he had to say to us after invading our Discord server like that? Like, why did he even think that any communication was welcome at all? Anyway, neither Nielsen nor I had any idea what Temple was talking about and just did not respond. Then Temple got ready to violate our privacy, as long as it's technically legal. So he asked this guy, Justin Malone. Justin Malone is a scumbag lawyer. Hey, in what circumstances is violating people's privacy illegal or force? And then you can ask, well, was he just worried about his own privacy? No, he's seeking license to violate others' privacy in his own words, right? So when I say he violated our privacy, those are his words, not mine. And then he says specifically the privacy of the members of, I say, it was specifically the privacy of the members of the Four Strands, given his previous accusation of slander. So Curi, Temple, writes, if someone praises FI in a private by convention chat room and then later slanders fallible ideas, and I shared, I'm not using force or violating law, blah, blah, blah. No signatures, no material harm. And Malone helps him. He says you'd have to disclose something that a reasonable person would find offensive or be, I mean, that kind of happened, but okay. Keywords here are invasion of privacy toward public, okay, blah, blah, blah. If one is only disclosing people's position on intellectual matters like the goodness of FI, it seems tough to frame that as offensive, end quote. Okay, so about a week later, February 3rd, Temple followed through, and then he published messages from both the Four Strands email group and the Discord server. And without consent, certainly he didn't have my consent. 2 days prior, on February 1st, he had sent Bruce and me another email pressuring us to take sides between him and that alleged aggressor. And then he also kept criticizing our group. Keeps saying that maybe we just wanted a soft group, more moderation of tone, which means he understands it. He admits that tone was a problem in our group. Again, I remind you of the things that I highlighted here earlier that I didn't feel comfortable saying out loud because the video might get punished for it. Anyway, you can read this, if you read this later, there's just so much stuff about, so much deflecting of responsibility. Like implicit insults, you could be in an intellectual group. No, we already were, even without him. Imply that we were being unreasonable for wanting to be left alone, apparently. We haven't explained what we're doing. We didn't have to explain ourselves to him. Like this, there's so much entitlement in his messages. And this is kind of the thing, a recurring theme when you interact with him, is that he drains so much of your energy as you discuss with him because he puts so many things on you. You have to explain yourself. You have to show proof or whatever. And he'll just never run out of things that you have to show him. If he wants to be right about something, he's going to find a way to be right about it. Just terrible, just absolutely draining. So once again, none of this makes sense because he's still pretending like he wants access to our group. So like insulting us is not going to make us want to give him access, right? That doesn't make any sense. And his possessive attitude just turns us away even more. So none of this makes any sense at all. He could have apologized for raiding our server, right? He could have at least acknowledged it. But I don't think he ever mentions it anywhere. He just pretended it never happened. And then he also accuses us of hiding content from him. But it's like, so that's more entitlement, right? He's implying that he had some claim to our content. But he didn't. We were not obligated to share anything with him. And he publicly accuses us of, quote, operating in the shadows, end quote. He did something similar when I collaborated with David Deutsch, that physicist I mentioned earlier, for a couple of years to translate one of Deutsch's books. And Temple just didn't know about that project. And I guess this bugged him for some reason. And then later he wrote, I think the quote was that David Deutsch and I worked, quote, behind the scenes, end quote. And it's like, why are you trying to make it sound shady? It's just a translation project, man. It has nothing to do with you. You just bothered that you didn't know about it. And then he's like trying to pass it off as this like creepy thing that we did. We translated a book. What's the big deal? Anyway, I believe I mentioned this earlier briefly, maybe, that Temple is socially competent. So none of these things can be accidents. Like, it'd be one thing if somebody was social, like if somebody keeps calling someone and don't get called back, and they just keep calling anyway. If they just don't know what they're doing wrong, that's one thing. Like, it's pretty clueless, but if they just don't know, that's one thing. But if they're well aware of the social rule that they're breaking, and they do it anyway, okay, that makes it much worse, because there's some malice there. These are no innocent mistakes. There's another theme with Temple where he keeps doing these things, and he's done this recently with me because he's been blogging about me again recently. I might go into this in another video, where he does this thing where to third parties who aren't initiated, who don't really know that much about the disagreement here, to them he would seem reasonable. Like in this instance, he could say, well, I sent these guys these emails, I requested permission and they just never got back to me. So how was I supposed to know what to do or how to interpret their silence? And then later, I emailed them again and extended an olive branch and said we could coexist, right? And then a third party might go, hey, maybe Elliot was being reasonable. Maybe they should have told him to back off or whatever, and they never did that, so it's really their fault. But really what he's doing is again, this possessive attitude, this kind of entitlement that just pushes people away. And all the while he gets to look reasonable when really he's being very, very difficult to deal with. And this we could coexist line was especially jarring. And I think it's another psychological confession that he made without realizing it, because coexist, again, it's like the sandwich store. The sandwich shop. If you operate a sandwich shop, imagine if your competitor from across the street, a perceived competitor, real, because again, I believe I've said this, I never considered the Four Strands to be a competitor of Elliot's. I don't think we had any interest in competing with him. So that's why I say real or perceived competitor. If the sandwich shop across the street, if the owner comes into your store, knocks on your door repeatedly and says, hey man, let me in. I just want to check behind your counter. I just want to see how you're doing things. That'd be creepy, right? That'd be weird. There'd be something wrong here. And imagine if the owner of the competing sandwich shop told you, hey man, we could coexist. You'd be freaked out too, right? That would be extremely weird. Yeah, it was just bizarre. Clearly, we were right to not want to have anything to do with him. He just gave us confirmation after confirmation of that. Anyway, then, Alan Forrester, that guy who made that list, that wonderful list of evaders, he requested access. Again, they're long-term associates, or at least they were at the time. It seems that as of late, there may have been a change there. But Alan Forrester requested access. You can see the screenshot here. He wanted to join the First Strands group. For obvious reasons, we denied the request. I mean, did he not know that we would deny it? I don't understand why he even sent the request. Like Temple knew that we knew that Forrester was an associate of his. Like that was no secret. So their attempts were coming off aggressive and invasive, and that just added to our distress. So I just told Temple, dude, stop emailing me. But he wouldn't stop emailing me because he interpreted this no contact request in a different way that gave him permission to email me about other matters later. And which is a continuation of that pattern, that it's on other people to explain themselves to his satisfaction, and like specifically in exactly the way that he needs. It's like he doesn't do that himself. It's like if somebody says, please stop emailing me, that's a sign that you just need to back way off and just leave them alone. Okay, so then Temple did something really shady. So I mentioned earlier, I believe, that Fallible Freeze, this Freeze guy, was a member of both the Four Strands and Fallible Ideas. We trusted Freeze at the time, and because they were a member of Four Strands, they obviously had visibility into Four Strands. They could see our messages, but they had our trust, and Temple knew this. And so Elliot Temple asked Fallible Freeze if he could borrow Freeze's account to collect our messages. Here's a screenshot. Freeze shared with us this screenshot at the time. This was all still happening very quickly. This is still February 3rd. So Curi writes, would you be willing to scrape? I think this first line, by the way, refers to my asking him to leave me alone. Something else from that same email. And then he says, would you, Freeze, be willing to scrape the Four Strands archives for me, or let me borrow your account to do it? Scrape basically means like download every last message. It's like scraping everything off a plate. It basically means like sharing, like doing any of this would mean Freeze would have to share his or her password with Elliot, which is super shady. So anyway, you can see, just to summarize this, I guess this was not just a summary, but also more commentary on this whole issue that, again, Elliot has been quiet about and evaded. So there's some additional commentary for you, but I think it's important people understand the kind of person he is. You could, like, I struggle to come up with like an honestly charitable interpretation of what genuine, legitimate reason he might have had to raid our Discord server like that and invade our privacy like that. Like, if he really thought, and he's written a lot about this, so, feel free to check out his blog and like come to your own conclusion, if this Andy B guy really bothered him, maybe Temple was like, oh man, I really need to see their messages because maybe there's something there that I could use to defend myself against Andy, right? But then why did he invite his other members? And why did he make a back door? And why did he invite other members to raid our server with him? Right? That goes way beyond any concern he might have had there. So there's more of the stuff about how he perceived it. This is just speculation, but there's also the stuff about how he perceived us as competitors, and maybe he just wanted to crush the competition and use the use public opinion or influence public opinion so that we wouldn't get any new members, which actually backfired spectacularly because he created a lot of smoke for people to find us and to look for us. And a lot of people just became interested in joining our group. Anyway, here's a timeline too. But yeah, I mean, really the main conclusion that I think people should draw from this whole fiasco is that Temple is a really creepy guy, and he has a severe disregard for privacy. And you should ask yourself if this is okay, and he should ask himself if that was okay, and it was not.